Welcome to One UN, One Voice with Ahmed Salim. The recent reform of the United Nations development system involves a set of far-reaching changes in the way the UN development system works to help countries around the world in achieving sustainable development goals. I quote United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, "The 2030 agenda will require bold changes to the UN development system for the emergence of a new generation of country teams centered on a strategic UN development cooperation framework and led by an impartial and independent resident coordinator." He further notes the reform aims are clear: to focus more on people and less on processes, to become more effective and efficient, and build a workplace of equality, diversity, and integrity. To discuss the UN reform, SDGs, and Agenda 2030, and UN's vision in Timor-Leste, we have Ms. Fumi Balogun. She has recently been appointed the new UN resident coordinator in Timor-Leste. Welcome, Ms. Balogun, to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important topic.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You arrived in Timor-Leste almost a month and a half ago. What do you like so far about Timor-Leste? And your first impressions of people, culture, music, art, and food. Does it remind you of any other place you have lived in?
I mean, it's strange that when I landed, of course, the first impression is the warmth of the people. The people were very warm, which in a way reminded me of my own place, my continent, which is Africa and Africans. But more importantly, when I stepped in, I thought to myself, oh, I'm actually going to enjoy this place. It does feel like I'm back in Africa, because you have to remember that Africa is also an island. So we are near water and all of the islands. And so that felt, so I felt very much at home when I got here.
Excellent, 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 Ms. Balogun. Just to start off, I would say, what are your thoughts about Timor-Leste regarding the development outlook and its potentials? Is Timor-Leste doing well?
Yes, I would say Timor-Leste is doing well. I mean, you have to remember that the restoration of independence was just about nearly 21 years ago. We just celebrated the 20 years of the restoration of independence. And Timor-Leste had to come from, you know, occupation, from a struggle, from a revolution, and to actually start to build a country from scratch. Not very many countries are able to do that, and not many countries have had that have that history that they have to start rebuilding a country from scratch. The institutions, the policies, the laws, everything, the schools, the educational system. So in that sense, I would say that Timor-Leste has done very well. The government, the successive governments, the leadership, they've worked very hard to get Timor-Leste to where it is. Of course, like with every country, including Timor-Leste, there are challenges in the achievement of the SDGs. It was not helped with COVID-19 pandemic, as you know. All of the gains that we made, some of them were impacted, you know, around trade, travel, people's businesses were lost, a lot of informal businesses where majority of the citizens were making an income, they could not make an income. So that had a big impact on the achievement of the SDGs. There are still very many things to do, of course, not saying that everything is perfect. Timor-Leste still has one of the highest rates of stunting in the world, which is a big challenge. For a country this size to have 47%, that's quite high. And the government, including the president, the prime minister, everybody has said that this is a big priority, and we can see that government is working very hard to achieve that priority. But in terms of food security, nutrition, there's still work to be done, health systems, making sure that all the citizens have access to health services, but also the big picture, how we link still, when we're talking about the achievement of SDGs, how we link the big vision, so around the ASEAN ascension, for example, economic diversification, to the social sectors. What do they mean? How are we going to support the government to do that? How do we look at the institutions, the policies, making sure that we have a rights-based approach, and making sure that all of this vision is linked, and we're able to put in resources, the appropriate resources, and make sure by 2030 we do achieve SDGs. So those are some of the challenges that we see. I mean, the opportunities, really not challenges, but how we can really achieve 2030 agenda in Timor-Leste.
But you mentioned about the challenges. Do you think, Timor-Leste has all the ingredients for success? What do you see in the next 10 years? Where do you see Timor-Leste in the next 10 years?
My wish, which might not be the reality. My wish would be to see that in 10 years we actually do achieve the SDGs, that every citizen has access to, that they have access to nutritious food, that they have access to economic livelihood, that all the citizens have access to health, that the public institutions work well to deliver services to people, that it is a digitalized economy, that, of course, that Timor-Leste continues to be a strong part and voice in international community within the United Nations, as well as within ASEAN in the region. So that's what I wish, and that's what I hope we're working towards.
No, yes. Excellent. Superb, I will say. And we are all working towards that direction. I'm sure that wish will come true 100%. So, Ms. Fumi, we have heard you saying that now my next question is, how we realize the vision, how we achieve, the SDGs, and how we overcome these challenges. And we have heard you saying many a times since you have arrived that you want to strengthen coordination among UN agencies. What is your vision, and how is it linked to the UN reform?
In your intro, you quoted the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, around an impartial and independent resident coordinator, but not just impartial and independent resident coordinator, but that is able to position the UN country team at the heart of the United Nations development system, and to be able to achieve the SDGs. So the vision is that the UN, everybody, that's one good thing. When I was also coming to Timor-Leste, everyone understands and accepts. In fact, everyone told me as I was coming that I'm very lucky, and I've seen that actually since I've been here, that I'm very lucky to be coming to Timor-Leste, because Timor-Leste has a unique history with the United Nations, and because of that, we have a lot of space to do a lot of work. The government is very supportive of the United Nations. I say it, what I have also seen, the government of Timor-Leste is very eager, and they are not shy to give even part of their resources to United Nations agencies to be able to implement certain areas of work. So maybe in governance, in health, in nutrition, in labor, around customs, in a lot of work on trade. But the United Nations, we want to strengthen our policy advice to government. So United Nations, we don't just want to be seen as delivering services and almost humanitarian in nature.
Or implementing projects.
That's not the main, which we do, and we do it well, but that's not the main goal of the United Nations. The United Nations country team in Timor-Leste is to provide a strategic, to help the government make a lot more connections around the policies. How are the policies interacting with each other? You know, if we want to do ASEAN, what does that mean, for example, for food security?
Very true.
How do we help government provide additional support, additional capacity and expertise that we bring from around the world as the United Nations to the government of Timor-Leste? So as a multilateral institution and as, you know, as United Nations, which I talk about all the time, the interest is primarily and only for Timor-Leste. So there's no agenda. It's to see how do we help, you know, the government to do this, make those connections with the policies, look at the capacities. What capacities would government need across board? And to be able to, so not to be in silos, but an integrated approach. These are the capacities that will be required in 10 years to be able to achieve the SDGs for the people of Timor-Leste. These are the kinds of investments that would need to be made. These are the kinds of, you know, partnerships and collaboration within Timor-Leste and externally outside of Timor-Leste that will need to happen for this for SDGs to be achieved, and of course the Timor-Leste's Sustainable Development Plan. How do we do that? We have to come together as a UN and bring all the expertise together, because all of the UN agencies have very unique expertise and mandates.
Very true.
Bringing all of that together, so we are speaking the same language and the same message to government. We don't also pull government in different directions. So that's the goal of a new of the UN reform, and a new reinvented RC system, and a new reinvigorated UN country team. That's what I hope to achieve while I'm here.
Excellent, 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 Ms. Fumi. So I will take it further. You mentioned about, you know, the development and how you see that, you know, how UN system as a whole together is going to enable, or going to facilitate the government to achieve the development goals. What is your development approach, and what are your, what do you think are the key development priorities in Timor-Leste?
We have, I mean, we say at the heart of the reinvigorated UN country team and the reform, and the UN reform itself, is the cooperation framework, UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. As the UN, we have, this has been done in Timor-Leste. So we have the UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework that drew from a lot of consultations with civil society, the media, government plans, policies, and did a comprehensive country analysis and assessment. Where do we see the most gaps? And what are the things that we need to do to support the government of Timor-Leste? And so with the cooperation framework, there were 6 priorities, of course, that were identified as the catalyst for growth, and how the UN can effectively support the government and contribute to the implementation of the SDGs. So for me, that's the vision. It's not just my personal vision, but a vision that has actually been built together, collaboratively, you know, in partnership. Leave no one behind. Yeah. Lots of consultations about what do we want to see, where are the gaps, and how can the UN fill those gaps while government is still doing all of this work. So around there are 6, of course, there are the 6 areas. I hope I can reel them off my head.
Nobody can.
So of course, we have the food systems and nutrition and food security. We have education, lifelong learning. We have resilience, to make sure that the economy is resilient. We have economic growth, diversification. We have governance, about the institutions, you know. So how do we make this, you know, they are connected in the outcomes, but also connected across the 6 outcomes. So making those connections. So when we talk about food systems and nutrition, you know, how do we connect that to governance?
Very true.
And to resilience. So we make one connection on one hand, and to education. What does it mean when we talk about food systems and we talk about education? How do we make that connection?
Very true. Just from my own understanding, are UN SDCF priorities linked to the government's development priorities?
Definitely. That's the number one priority. Right. That's the number one, not just priority, but number one. What's this word now? That's the first thing you have to do. You have to link.
But we can
yes,
edit it. Yeah.
You have to link your cooperation development cooperation framework to the government's strategic development plan, which was what happened in Timor-Leste. It's from, of course, 2021 to 2025. The UN's cooperation framework, because there should be time for flexibility and realignment as things evolve. So that's the number one consideration when you are thinking about a cooperation framework. So it's consultation, it's an assessment that is with government, but independent. So it's not influenced by anything. It's looking at all of the analysis and assessments and evaluations that have been made and pulling all of that and then subjecting all of this to consultations, like I said earlier. So so that becomes the most strategic document for the UN, but also the way the government, because the government also signs on to the cooperation framework, that the government holds the UN accountable to what support the UN gives to government, to say, we agreed collectively that these are the things you will do and to support us. How are you doing that? So like I said earlier, policy advice, program implementation, capacity building, because when you talk about project implementation, the UN is not just, we don't deliver services per se. We are building the capacities of government institutions to deliver those services. So during COVID, we saw how excellent the UN and the government work together with other development partners to make sure that we respond and build the health systems very quickly. You know, WHO, UNICEF, UNDP, coming together. This is what the UN reform is about.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ms. Fumi. You have just covered everything very nicely. From my own point of view, journalistic point of view, I see a huge challenge in that. For instance, on one side, we have government's vision, and then on the other side, our own development vision, United Nations development vision, is aligned with government's priorities. So priorities are set. So now we have a host of implementers, you know, around us. We have UN, and when we break down UN, we have UN agencies. In Timor-Leste, we have 21 UN agencies. Then we have multilaterals, then we have bilaterals, then we have other development partners, INGOs. So how to bring all of them together? You have been saying you have been meeting with ambassadors, you have been meeting with the government counterparts, ministers, you met with His Excellency the President, His Excellency the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister. So how would you bring all of them together so that, you know, the entire development sector moves in one direction that has been set by the government, owned by the government, supported by the United Nations?
That's the main, that's my main vision, and I hope that I will be able to achieve that in the years that I'm hopefully going to be here. It's to re-emphasize the role and the influence to an extent of the United Nations, because all development partners, bilateral partners, are member states of the UN, even though they have bilateral relationships with the government of Timor-Leste. But they are still, all of us are member states of the UN. And the UN is the space where those issues were negotiated, SDGs, and I go back to the Sustainable Development Goals. That was a strong negotiation that all member states agreed to do, to implement and to pool their resources. The role of the UN is to pull us all together and make sure that our development assistance continues to be aligned to the
with
achievement of the SDGs, the acceleration now, because now we're falling a little bit behind, not just in Timor-Leste, but in a lot of countries. Now we want to pull, as my role as the independent and impartial resident coordinator, because I say it all the time, I don't represent any country, I represent the United Nations, which means I represent everybody here.
Very true, very true.
So my goal is primarily the government and the people of Timor-Leste. How do we pull all the resources that we have and all of the analysis in a way that best supports the government, so that we're not pulling governments in the same direction? And goes back to what I said earlier about the primary role of the UN is policy advice and making sure there's coherence. And that includes bilateral relationships. It includes where funding and aid is going. It includes being able to help government make decisions around their engagement. It includes bringing all the other member states that are partners together to understand what the UN is doing in the achievement of the SDGs, and also what government is doing, how our work is aligned. So that, because I said, and as I've met the excellencies, the ambassadors, I've told them that their role here is not just to support Timor-Leste, even though that is the primary goal, but also to hold the UN accountable to what the UN is doing on what has been globally agreed.
They have twofold relations.
Yes.
One is the bilateral relation,
and
the other one is the multilateral relations, which comes through United Nations as a member state.
And we have, as my role, is to bridge that gap. I think a lot of bilateral relationships focus more on the bilateral and a little less on the multilateralism. But how do we pull it together so that they also position their assistance and locate it within the Sustainable Development Goals? That's what I would like to see. And for government to also be able to corral everybody, but with support and advice of the United Nations in Timor-Leste.
So thank you, Ms. Balogun. You mentioned about the challenges. And one of the challenges I wanted to allude to is internal challenge. Most of the times there is a criticism, not most of the times, maybe few times or many times, or maybe most of the times, I'm not sure, but there is a criticism that UN agencies are project-based and they're quite projectivized implementation and not strategically integrated. So what is your take on this, and how can the UN become more efficient and more coordinated and more together as one UN family?
Yes, thank you. I mean, because a lot of times we in the United Nations, we like to kind of speak very highly of the work that we do, which is normal, I think. Which is normal. I think everybody speaks about the good things that they do. And I think it's a fair, I mean, fair in the sense that we have perception as important as the truth. So even if we're not project-based as the United Nations, which is what I feel, I don't think we're project-based. If the perception is that we're project-based, then it's something that we've been reflecting on collectively as the United Nations in Timor-Leste, to think, okay, we don't want to see, I certainly don't want to see the United Nations as just a humanitarian agency. Just humanitarian, which means just providing services. And when United Nations moves more and more into providing services, there's the danger of it being seen more as project-based, because then it means you look for resources, you get food, you get shelter when there's a crisis, which we have a strong role in doing, and we do that, and that's very important. But where the United Nations is actually very strong is the ability to work within development and the humanitarian, and still have the development very focused. Governance issues you need to, so there are agencies that are focused on the governance, decentralization, public sector reform, financial reform, management, all of those kinds of work, and link it to humanitarian crisis. What we want is a reduction of humanitarian crisis, a much more integrated approach to preparedness, and also to make sure so that we have very little, because we're not the only ones, I say it, not Timor-Leste, but a lot of countries. Most of us are affected by climate change. Most countries are affected, but in very many countries, they have floods. There are floods in the United States, for example. There are floods in everywhere, or changes, but they are prepared enough. So governance structures are strong enough to be able to respond very quickly and limit the impact on livelihoods and on people. And so that's what we want. To do the humanitarian bit, to help government strengthen the humanitarian, which is provision of services, but work on the services. So back to the criticism, it's getting the UN to work more, and that's the essence of the reform.
Very true.
To work more as one and look at development, humanitarian, and peace. How do we make the linkages? How do we give advice that is coordinated?
And how do we connect the dots?
How do we connect the dots? So it will require us working better in the UN itself as a UN country team. So we have to do more joint analysis. We have to do more joint assessments as the UN. We have to make the connections in all the work that we do. We have to be able to speak about the UN. Not that we won't still have agencies speaking about, but at least collectively, we have the big picture and we know what we need to do, which capacities we need to strengthen, which investments we need to make collectively. So that's how I would want to respond to that's the vision. But there will always be instances where UN would step in to implement a project on behalf of government, to support government, do specific things. That's normal, and that's a key role of the UN, but that's not the only role. So we have to make sure that the other parts of our work is also public. And that government also recognizes that policy advice, strategic decision taking that we can do collectively and help government, that we see that, and the general public also sees that role.
Thank you so much, Ms. Balogun. We'll take a short break here. Viewers, we'll be with you in a short while. Please stay with us. Stay tuned for more.
On the 1st of January, the United Nations Development System embarks on a reform journey of transformation. At the helm of this transformation is the new resident coordinator system, which puts countries at the forefront. Together, we will strengthen the 2030 agenda at the country level. We aim to consolidate their teamwork and deepen accountability in delivering meaningful results for people. For more than 70 years, the United Nations has helped to improve the lives of millions of people across the globe. The Millennium Development Goals laid a really good foundation. Today, both people and planet need us to do even more. We need a 21st century United Nations able to respond to the paradigm shift reflected in the 2030 Agenda. Our organisation will be more focused on collective results and less on individual mandates, more attuned to national needs and priorities, and less entangled by inefficient layers of bureaucracy. This is the most ambitious reform of the United Nations Development System in decades. The General Assembly has shown strong leadership in providing the mandates for change requested by the Secretary-General. We are now taking forward those decisions with determination. The process will affect every UN entity, our UNDS leadership, and all staff. And it will not be an easy task or journey. The next 12 to 18 months will take us out of our comfort zone. It starts with a reinvigorated, independent and impartial resident coordinator, a strengthened resident coordinator's office, and a new generation of country teams that are more responsive, more collaborative, with new skill sets and full-time leadership to drive our work and strengthen results. Every member state, every staff member, and each of our partners across government and civil society will play an essential role in implementing this reform. We all need to be agents of transformation, changing our mindsets for a new era. Our objectives are clear. This is about serving people everywhere and about leaving no one behind. As the chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group, I am really confident that we can take this leap of faith in embracing the Secretary-General's vision. Expectations are really high. Member states are counting on us to deliver. Achieving the SDGs everywhere is a promise we can't afford to break. The consequences would be dire for people, for the planet, and across the globe. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done. So let's get it done together.
Welcome back to One UN, One Voice. Thank you, viewers, for staying with us. Thank you, Ms. Fomey. Before the break, you were talking about the UN reform, how and what it entails for the government, for the people of Timor-Leste, and what it entails for the UN agencies and for all of us. I will quote the UN reform that aims at a new generation of UN country team that is tailored to the context and that delivers shared results, including through a redesigned United Nations Development Cooperation Framework that becomes the main strategic instrument to respond to national needs and priorities. Is that happening? And how would you achieve this here in Timor-Leste?
Like I said earlier, thank you for the question. We have a cooperation framework that is strategic, that was developed through consultations, including, of course, and actually in co-leadership, co-created by the government of Timor-Leste and all the partners, civil society, all the media, all of the institutions. And what we need to do now as the United Nations in Timor-Leste is to bring that cooperation framework again back at the center of our work, and to be able to demonstrate the results, not just the results, what we're achieving, and I've been saying this, it's not just what we're achieving as individual agencies, for example, which are important achievements and results, but what we're achieving collectively. Not just collectively, but how are we actively contributing to the results that government is also achieving. So can we say definitively that in 1 year, in 2 years, with UN support, this is the progress that government would have made.
Very true.
And to be able to do that is not, like I said earlier as well, it's not just the UN. It's how do we bring all the partnerships, all the development assistance together and be able to track the results that we're making. So it's not the European Union's results here, USAID results, the embassies, the government of Portugal, UNICEF there, UNDP there, all of the things we're doing differently that are important. How do we bring the cooperation framework gives us an opportunity to pull all of this together? So even use it as a strategic platform for analysis for all the other partners of government. So it's not just a UN document and a UN strategic document, but a strategic document of partnership with the government of Timor-Leste. That way it enables us to be much more critical about our results. It forces us to be coordinated. And by coordinated, we help government also in their own coordination. So we are not pulling government in so many different directions without making those linkages. So that's what I hope to do. I want to continue to do within the UN, to bring the coordination not just among UN agencies, but to expand the coordination beyond the UN to other development partners. So we are able to, and government can see very clearly what all of us are contributing and how we are supporting them and what are the gaps. So it makes it easier to see where we've made progress and maybe we need less investment, and where we do need more investment, and how we do those investments collectively. Because at the end of the day, UN or development assistance, it's a lot of money and it's a lot of support that I'm sure the government appreciates, but it's still not as much as what government has itself.
Very true.
So they need to see, this is where our resources are. All of these other resources, this is what it's doing. This is how, so not just a technical exercise of, we have this amount of resources coming into the country, but going beyond the technical to say, these resources are actually helping us to do A, B, C, D. And also enables government to then become even a lot more proactive in the way they tell us what they want us to do.
Very true.
That is how I see the work going.
Ms. Balogun, you mentioned about bringing all the development partners together. How difficult or how easy do you think it could be?
I mean, it always sounds easy when you say it. It's like just coordination. It should not be a problem, but it's actually the biggest problem. So, I mean, I have to admit, because everybody, and it's human nature, everybody wants to see their work.
Of course.
Everybody wants to have access. Everybody wants to be able to show that this is what they're doing, this is how they're doing it, and for government to see that. So the fear with people is that when things are coordinated,
very true,
it's difficult to see
that who contributed
what, who is doing
true.
What, and that might impact on how your organization is seen, your partnership is viewed, how you're able to mobilize additional resources, all of those factors, and they're very important factors. But what I say all the time, and that's why I'm the impartial and independent coordinator, is that we have to look at the big picture. We're all here to achieve the SDGs.
Very true.
Is it more? What is more important?
And which are agreed by all the member states, actually.
Yes. So I'm almost going to be like a preacher, and
a passionate preacher.
Yes. So it's influence without authority. To showcase what changes we're making and do that incrementally, that people would begin to see the value of coordination, and we would want to do more and more of it. Not lots and lots of coordination mechanisms, but fewer, much more strategic, and much more beneficial to the government of Timor-Leste.
Very true. Thank you very much, Ms. Balogun. Very, very well said. That brings us to our last question, and that brings us to the close of the program also. Timor-Leste has to gear up its efforts to achieve Agenda 2030. We are left with, 7 years, less than 7 years. What is your advice to the government, the development sector, and the UN agencies to fast-track our joint efforts?
I think the advice is the same, not the same, but what I've been saying, a coordinated approach to development that is very coordinated, that is aligned, so we know exactly what the gaps are collectively, and we agree that these are the main gaps. And when you look at the gaps and the challenges and the opportunities, so looking at all of the things that are happening and make the connection. So all these things I have said, I'm also coming back to them. So we want ASEAN Ascension, for example. How is that connected to governance? Because it's not, so on one hand, there are all sorts of benefits around trade, around movement of people, increased access to resources by being a member of ASEAN and being part of a community that provides a lot of opportunities for Timor-Leste, on one hand. All of these opportunities would require a lot of changes in the way in financial management and allocation of resources, development of programs and budgeting. It will require a new look at it. What capacities will be needed, not just to be member, but capacities to take advantage of the trade, of all of the opportunities that will come. And all of these opportunities and capacities are also linked to important social sectors like education. How are we doing with education, nutrition? Because ultimately, when we talk about development, when we talk about ASEAN, WTO, everything SDGs, is the people.
At the end of the day,
at the end of the day, it's the people
of that country.
How the benefit, what they see. All this that we are doing is to benefit the people of the country. So at the end of the day, what kinds of education are they getting? How do we use that to influence the education, the skill set, digital skills, access to the internet, choices, personal choices, sexual and reproductive health and rights, all of those things around an individual, nutrition, because it is only people who will benefit, who will take advantage from opportunities. It's not going to be structures. So how do we also link that to the people? What capacities are needed? So with government, looking at this connection, making this connection, and making the right investments and budget allocation, and the reforms, looking at the reforms, what reform would be needed?
Very true.
How can we make sure that our laws and policies do not contradict each other, they're aligned with each other, they are centered on rights?
Very
People who are vulnerable are not left behind. Women are integrated into it. People living with disabilities, LGBTQI groups, all of those that have more vulnerabilities. Are we recognizing those vulnerabilities? How are we taking advantage of the opportunities? How are we supporting the people? So you make those connections and you make the investment. So for government, it's the right investment and the right reforms. For UN, is to support government to make those decisions by providing better assessment, better analysis, policy advice that is based on that, development partners to see the value of the UN and bring all of it together, and to respect and acknowledge and understand, because they can only do all of that if the advice and the strategic options that we provide are superior, and to get development partners, including bilateral governments, to fall behind those advice and government. So we're all moving in the same direction, and we can say categorically that in 20 years, in 10 years, this is what we would see in Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Ms. Fumi, for joining us for One UN, One Voice, and thanks for sharing your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. It was a real pleasure to be here.